Okay, and before the official seminar, here's a brief info slide containing link to the seminar series webpage, how to sign up for updates. All of this is on this site. Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's SoFiE Seminar. I'm Andrew Patton, the organizer of the series. Today, I'm happy to host Eric Ghysels from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as our speaker. His discussant will be Max Farrell from the University of Chicago. We'll follow the same format as in the past weeks. We'll have 40 minutes for the speaker, 10 to 15 for the discussant, and then 5 or 10 for Q&A. And if the Q&A session spills over the 1 hour mark or so, we'll move to the post-seminar session where we'll end the recording and we can all interact in a more informal way. If you'd like to ask a question during the seminar, you can do it either by using the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen or by using the Q&A box also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Eric. Please take it away.
Let me share my screen. I think you can see my screen now. Is that right? Good. All right. First of all, thank you, Andrew, for inviting us to present some of our work. And actually, more broadly, thanks for organizing or hosting these SoFiE webinars. They're a great service to the profession. I'm going to actually talk about some work that is co-authored with my colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Andrew Patton, Ryan Ball from the University of Michigan, and Johannes Triaukas from Université Catholique de Louvain. Okay. So I will not only talk about that paper, but also some background material that is related to work that I have with Jonas and Andri, one on machine learning and time series regressions with application to nowcasting, which is forthcoming in JBS, and another paper on high dimensional Granger causality, high dimensional time series Granger causality. Let me start perhaps by reminding the audience what nowcasting is. It's a term that originated in meteorology and pertains to prediction of the present or very near future. In economic applications, it's sort of essentially a mixed frequency data problem because the object is usually a low frequency series, say quarterly, whereas the information flow is either monthly or weekly or daily. And the prime example of nowcasting is, of course, GDP. Lots of resources and efforts are devoted to that by central banks, among others. The typical setting for nowcasting GDP growth is a dynamic factor model, which is cast into a state space model, and then the Kalman filter is used or some variation of that in order to nowcast GDP growth. Now, in recent years, we've seen an expansion of the data series that are being considered for nowcasting. And in fact, we have what's sort of known as non-standard data sets, such as merchant-specific credit card spending and location data, app use by various merchant categories, textual analysis, satellite data, Google mobility data, and that's just a partial list. And so we're getting into really vast data, potentially very vast data sets for nowcasting, in this particular case, GDP growth. And that poses some challenges in terms of the numerical complexities involving with the estimation of dynamic factor models, state space models. And for one series, the one that is sort of the prime example, that might still be a compelling exercise despite the computational challenges. But when you're thinking about broadening sort of the scope of nowcasting to potentially a large set of targets of interest, then these computationally complex solutions may not be as appealing anymore. And that is particularly what we're thinking about here in this application is nowcasting for price earnings ratios. There are lots of firms out there, and so there are many candidate series that you might be interested in. I mentioned other work by Andri and Jonas and I. In a paper on using machine learning techniques, we looked at nowcasting GDP growth, but instead of state space models, we're looking at the regularized regression models, Midas regression models. And we did two types of exercises. One where we compared Midas regression machine learning models with the same quote unquote standard data that are also used by the New York Fed. And so that was sort of basically comparing methods with the same data. And that comparison yielded that we either were at par pretty much in terms of nowcasting or we're doing better. But of course, the machine learning setting allows us to look at potentially very large data sets of series. And once we started to endeavor into such things as textual analysis of Wall Street Journal articles and others to improve nowcast, we did actually indeed find improvements with those types of series being added and at very little additional computational costs. Now, the challenges are not so trivial because you might sort of think, okay, let's just take off-the-shelf lasso regularization of regression models, for instance. Now, the problem with that is, and it's a generic problem for time series, vast or large dimensional time series data of the same or mixed frequency, is that what happens is that you actually have to make two decisions. On the one hand, you have to select a series that you want to use in your nowcasting or forecasting exercise. That's one thing. And on the other hand, you actually, once you have selected a variable, you have to also decide on how many lags you want to include into your model. And straight lasso doesn't really recognize that structure of on the one hand, the variable selection, and on the other hand, the lag selection. And so what we actually have been pursuing in our work is to rely on a notion of what's known as sparse group lasso, originated in a paper by Simon, Friedman, Hasty, and Tibshirani. And the way we are using sparse group lasso is that it allows us to recognize that data structure, that large dimensional time series data structure that I alluded to earlier, in the sense that on the one hand, it allows us to define groups as all the high frequency lags of a specific covariate. That's one thing. Which then allows us to select group among groups, which is the variable selection problem. And then within the groups, we can basically start thinking about the lag selection problem. And therefore, we have sort of, we sort of build in the data structure into the regularization. The other advantage of that is that the sparse group lasso theory that we develop, since lasso and group lasso are special cases, and also the single group resembles elastic net, we sort of also have a theory for those special cases. Now, what we're going to be talking about is panel regression models with mixed frequency data for the purpose of nowcasting price earnings ratio. And there is some literature related to what I'm going to be talking about. I have earlier work with one of the co-authors of this paper, Ryan Ball. We looked at nowcasting price earnings ratio, but not using machine learning. We used just forecast combinations of Midas regressions, and I'll come back to that paper in a second. There are a number of papers on panel data Midas regression models as well, but again, this is not in a machine learning context. And there are quite a few high dimensional panel data papers out there as well. But we are emphasizing on the potential issues such as heavy tail data, which is very relevant for some of the applications that we are looking at, which were not considered in those papers. I'm quoting actually a title from my paper with Ryan. It's Automated Earnings Forecast, Beat Analysts or Combine and Conquer. And we're kind of using that paper an analogy with self-driving cars. So ultimately, the goal is to you have a fully automated driverless car without human intervention. And if you sort of portray that in terms of price earnings forecasting or nowcasting, you want to sort of have everything automated without any human intervention. That's a goal, that's sort of an objective. But more intermediate term or near future, perhaps a less ambitious technology, going back to the self-driving car analogy, is to basically have AI assist an actively engaged driver. And you could sort of think about that analogy as being here in terms of nowcasting earnings, is that we ultimately would want to have a fully automated system. But perhaps for the moment, at least, that may not be achievable for all firms that we will be looking at. And therefore, the great advantage, of course, of the regularized regression machine learning settings is that we can peer through vast amount of data. And that is beyond sort of typically what the human brain can comprehend in terms of data analysis. And so the combination of analysts with the machine learning techniques is something that we might be striving for in the short run. In terms of contributions, we're looking at panel data settings using sparse group lasso, which I alluded to earlier, with Midas specifications involving Legendre polynomials. I will clarify that in the next slides. We are looking at concentration inequalities, Fuchnagayev inequalities for heavy-tailed tau mixing processes that I will cover later. And we derive the asymptotic properties, debiased CLT and hack estimators also, at least for the setup that we're looking at. And then last but not least, we're looking at a panel of nowcasting price earnings ratio with our methods. For the moment, we're roughly 30% of the firms we outperform analysts. But for the other ones, we're seeing that the methods that we propose actually improve on existing machine learning methods. The structure of the talk is the following. I'm going to review a little bit what the models and the estimators look like for high-dimensional mixed frequency time series data. Then I'll cover the asymptotic theory. We'll get to panel data. So the first 2 points will actually cover single equation cases, basically to cover a lot of the intuition that we will need for the high dimensional data, and also the single regression case is more complete in terms of development. And then we'll look at the application, and I'll conclude with remarks and future research. So we're looking at capital K potential regressors or predictors, and K is large. Each of those K regressors are potentially observable at a high frequency, at a higher frequency than the target. We are looking at a linear forecasting equation that may include lag-dependent variables, so that the polynomials here are both in terms of covariates or features and lag-dependent variables. And so when you kind of count all the parameters potentially that you are looking at, M is the frequency mismatch, quarterly versus daily or monthly or weekly. You have M times K with both M and K being large. So this is a typical high dimensional time series prediction problem. We are doing a dimensionality reduction as is typical in a mixed frequency setting. We're looking at hyperparameterized weighting schemes, and as is typical in the Midas regression. And we're looking actually at a version of it that can be accommodated by linear regression formats and linear specifications, in the sense that we are looking at a product of a weighting scheme taken from, to use the language of machine learning, a dictionary. And we're thinking of an approximately sparse representation of those regression models. So in terms of the actual weighting schemes or the dictionary that we're using, we're looking at a number of specifications that I'll get to in the next slide, actually. But before I get to that, we're going to talk about sparse group lassos. So we're going to have to define what groups are. And groups are defined as all the high frequency lags of a specific covariate. So that's a group. And we are basically looking at the shape of the lag structures within groups. And we're going to look at, on the other hand, also obviously the selection of regressors. So that is being combined in the structured sparsity that we're going to be looking at. Sparse groups lasso does cover, as I mentioned earlier, both lasso and group lasso as special cases. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are in terms of the polynomials that we're looking at, we're going to look at orthogonal Legendre polynomials. The reason why that is appealing as opposed to, for instance, almond polynomials is that they're orthogonalized. And so you're basically now thinking about a high dimensional regression with expansions of lag structures, high frequency lag structures that follow an orthogonal structure. I have at the bottom of this slide the 5 first Legendre polynomials. So it's obviously linear, quadratic, cubic, etc. But you can see that they're special polynomials in order to make them mutually orthogonal, which is convenient for expansion of the regression models. It is a linear regression model in terms of linear in parameters. So we are using the conventional convex optimization problems, as is very common in machine learning. So the sparse group lasso solves the least squares problem, a linear least squares problem with a linear specification, and a penalty. Lambda is the usual regularization parameter, and then omega is itself also a combination of, on the one hand, an L1 penalty on the entire parameter space, and on the other hand, a sum of, or the L2 penalties for each of the groups separately. And it has basically a convex combination of these two. So it basically trades off, on the one hand, overall sparsity and also sparsity within groups. So there are two tuning parameter or regularization parameters. On the one hand, there is the lambda, and there is also the one that settles the convex combination between the L1 and sum of L2 penalties. So let me talk a little bit about about the asymptotic theory and also the Hague-based inference. So we look at something that is known as Fuchnagayev inequalities. The appeal of that is that we're looking both at heavy-tailed, potentially heavy-tailed, and dependent processes, because in our financial applications, that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about our regressors. And so we have, on the one hand, a condition on the existence of moments, which is telling something about tails. And we're looking at a notion of tau mixing. Tau mixing includes alpha mixing as a special case, which is alpha mixing is the sort of mixing condition that is very often used in the econometrics literature. And it turns out that we have a bound on the sample average in terms of sup norm that both has a polynomial and an exponential part to the bound. First of all, this bound is a generalization of the original Fuchnagayev inequality for independent data. We have something here that the polynomial part versus the exponential part, you could sort of think of as the exponential part to be the CLT part, if you like, sort of the Gaussian part of that bound. And then there is sort of the polynomial heavy tail correction that is the one that is highlighted in red. And kappa, which features in that polynomial part, is basically a combination of on the one hand, the tau dependence parameter and the moment the existence of moments parameter or condition that we have on the previous slides. These bounds are sharp, unlike for instance, Markov or Rosenthal type inequalities. Based on those Fuchnagayev inequality, we can have convergence rates both on the parameter estimates as well as on the predictions. We require, in terms of sparsity, in terms of actually regressors, P is the number of regressors. We have a little bit tighter restrictions than the usual OLS. It involves again kappa, which was that mixture of existence of moments and a mixing condition. And so it has an effect of putting more restrictions on P, which is the number of regressors. As you get lighter tails and less persistence, you can sort of handle more high dimensional data. That's sort of one of the lessons that come out of this theorem. We get, obviously, lasso type estimators are biased. We know that. So we need to think about debiasing the estimators. And we have an explicit bias correction here that then gives us an asymptotic distribution root T convergence to a normal distribution with a long run variance, as we typically do in our standard econometric setting. This is a restriction on the sparsity of the number of regressors that we can allow for. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to just spend a little bit of time, as we usually do in econometrics, because this is deviating from the standard machine learning literature, where usually both the regressors are IID and the errors are IID. Here, we're not necessarily assuming that the residuals from our sparse group lasso model are IID, and so we're thinking about hack type estimators. So the hack type estimator is the usual Newey West or Andrews or variations thereof. It's a kernel-based estimator involving leads and lags of autocovariances, where MT is the bandwidth parameter or the truncation parameter, if you like. And what is interesting about this is that we are familiar with this as econometricians to think about bandwidth selection in the standard setting, but here in this high dimensional setting, the bandwidth parameter actually is again a function of the number of covariates, the tail behavior, and the dependence through this kappa parameter. Now, of course, once we have these estimates for the long run variance, we can do proper inference on the parameters, on the debiased parameter estimates of our sparse group lasso regression models, and that leads to things such as performing gradient causality tests in high dimensional time series regression settings. One of the papers that I alluded to in the beginning of my talk, actually. Now, the purpose of this was to kind of go through the mechanics of all this in a single regression setting. So that we went through the Fuchnagayev inequalities and then talked about convergence. So now we're going to switch to panel regressions, having all these intuition for the single regression case. We're looking at a linear panel model, and I is going to reflect the cross-section, and that is the number of firms in our application. We're looking at mixed frequency panel models again, in the sense that we are looking at predicting price earnings ratio, which are quarterly. And we have observations during the quarter about both the macroeconomy as firm-specific information, and there's plenty of that, so it's a high-dimensional system again. We're looking at Midas polynomials of the same type as we had in the previous slides, which is the Legendre polynomials for the lag structures. And we are looking at two types of estimators. On the one hand, we're looking at pooled panel data sparse group lasso estimators with, again, that same penalty that involves basically a convex combination of L1 penalty on the entire parameter space and the sum of L2 penalties on each of the groups, which is the collection of all the high frequency lags of a specific covariate. So the pooled parameter estimate model is one model that we are looking at in a panel set data setting. And the second one is the fixed effects model, where we have, in terms of our application, firm-specific fixed effects. So we're looking at both of these. Going through, by analogy, again, the analysis for the single regression case, we have, again, a Fuchnagayev type inequality that is the underpinnings for the asymptotic analysis for panel data in this case, which again entails talking about the tail behavior, or more specifically, the existence of moments across all the models in the cross-section this time of the panel. And we're also talking about the dependence structure via this notion of tau mixing. Again, by analogy, what we had for the single regression case, we have now average, or if you were to scale by n and t, the soup norm of that, with, again, a polynomial and an exponential part of the bound, where we have, again, sort of these two things entering in terms of what we talked about earlier in the single regression case, the CLT part and the heavy tailed part of those bounds. That gives us convergence rates on both the predictions and the parameter estimates. The parameter estimates being a combination of either for the pooled regression or for the fixed effect regression. And the kappa is, again, that combination of tail and dependence features in the data. The prediction accuracy depends on kappa, as you can see. And there is also, again, a polynomial dependence on P, which is the number of potential regressors. That was for the pooled panel model. The fixed effect model is a little bit more, I guess, messy, if I can use that word, for the convergence properties. What's interesting is that the impact of the fixed effects, all these parameters that you have to estimate, in our case for the firm-specific effects, kind of has an impact that is very similar on the impact on the predictions that is quite similar to the ones of the number of time-varying covariates, actually. Now, in the last part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the application, which is the earnings nowcasting. We are thinking of a setting where we're looking at the second month of a quarter. The reason, earnings are quarterly, and they're usually announced the next quarter. So that's the reason why we want to nowcast. Very similar to GDP growth, essentially. It's the same sort of timing And we're looking at the second month of a quarter because that means that we have the earnings from the previous quarter in the information set. So it allows us to have the lag dependent variables. If you go earlier than that, you have to sort of have push back 1 quarter in terms of lags. We're looking at the price earnings ratio. In my paper with Ryan Ball, Management Science 2018 paper, we didn't look at machine learning models, unlike here. What we looked at was just forecast combinations of single regression Midas models. And we looked at either beating analysts, as I mentioned earlier, or add forecast combinations, or use forecast combinations rather, that included, besides the analysts' predictions, also our Midas predictions. And the main finding of that paper was that indeed analysts' forecast could be improved upon by adding this information from Midas regressions. So we're looking at the very same question, how we can sort of either completely automate price earnings forecast without and do better than analysts, or if we don't actually, whether there is actually money left on the table, if I can use that word, that expression, by looking at the fact that machine learning techniques allow us to plow through high dimensional data and find predictable patterns. And in particular, also exploit the panel data structure in this application, actually. We're looking at, in terms of information sets, both CompuStat and CRISP data in terms of earnings and accounting data, as well as financial series. We're looking at macro data as well, and we're looking at news textual analysis from Wall Street Journal articles. And finally, we're also using at sentiment analysis that is being recorded by Ravenpack. We're looking at 210 US firms because we're looking at firms for which we don't have missing values between 2000 and 2017, and a total of 28 predictors monthly or daily. We're starting in Q3 in terms of the actual analysis due to the lags, and we're having 42 observations for out of sample performance. This is basically looking at out of sample mean squared errors for price earning ratios. The first thing to look at is the random walk model, which is the usual benchmark, random walk for the price earnings ratio. If you look actually at the mean squared error of analysts, average across firms, it's not that much different from a random walk, but the median at least is an improvement relative to the random walk. The rest of the table is our panel data models. Actually, to be more accurate, on the one hand, individual regression models, where we don't exploit the panel structure, pooled panel data models, and fixed effect panel data models. We are looking at, we have 2 tuning parameters or regularization parameters for our setting, for the sparse group lasso setting. There is lambda, and there is gamma. The gamma is the one that is the convex combination allocation between the L1 penalty and the sum of L2 penalties. And we basically display here results for a grid of those from 0 to 1. And the lambda parameter, which is the regularization of the sparse group lasso penalty, is either chosen by a cross-validation BIC, AIC, or a correction of AIC. And what you see here is that you get important improvements in terms of the Midas regression machine learning panel data models in terms of out of sample mean squared errors, at least in terms of point estimates. You actually get the panel regressions outperform the single regression models. So if you go back to this slide, you can see that it's either the pooled or the fixed effect panel regression models that are the better ones compared to the individual ones. And we really want to have that sparsity, that convex combination between the L1 and L2 penalties, in the sense that the better results are the ones that are in the middle of this table, which is neither for gamma equal to 0 nor gamma equal to 1. And we usually have the fixed effects that are the better models compared to the pooled ones, except for the cross-validation. That was the first one here that appeared on this table. And you could sort of think about that. Perhaps the fact is that you, of course, with cross-validation, you have you basically carve the sample into subsamples, and there might be just sort of a small sample, a smaller sample effect that might be favoring the pool estimates actually. Now that's just the point estimates on the mean out of sample mean squared errors. We're also actually looking at Diebold-Mariano type testing to check whether those really are significant, statistically insignificant improvements. And if you actually look at the full sample, we do better, but not significantly better. That's what it is. That's what the Diebold-Mariano statistics tell us. There is another thing that we look at, since we really talked so much about the tail behavior, and you know, for a lot of financial econometrics applications, we have heavy tail data. So, and in particular in this setting, earnings do have some serious heavy tail properties. So for those of you who might remember Dan Nelson's eGarch paper, we look actually at the generalized error distribution, which has a shape parameter, and that shape parameter is a continuous variable. If it's equal to 2, we have a Gaussian tails. If it's below 2, you have thick tails and thin tails if it's above 2. So obviously we have here all values that are below 2, which means heavy tails. But what's interesting to note is that we separate the cases where both elastic net and sparse group lasso do better on the one hand, or sparse group lasso but not elastic net does better, and then neither of them actually outperform analysts. So in regards to the elastic net and sparse group lasso relative to sparse group lasso, you can see that as you get smaller values, particularly also for those where we do not outperform, the one is very heavy tailed actually. We see that there are improvements for thick tail data, but not as thick tailed as in the entire sample. And the improvements from elastic net and lasso versus sparse group lasso is also when we actually have thicker tails than the one that where elastic net actually also works. In terms of numbers of firms, and by the way, these are the residual, these are the tail indices or the estimates of this shape parameter for the residuals, and this is for the regressants, or the left-hand side variables, that is to say the price earnings ratios. In terms of actually the number of firms, we're about 60, 63, 66 firms that basically machine learning panel regression models, either pooled or fixed effects, outperform analysts. If you then sort of add the ones that are only due to sparse group lasso, or that is to say, actually take also into account the tail behavior, you get another 12 or 8 depending on the setting, which is another, relatively speaking, 20% of those 63. And so that is, if you sort of look at it overall, you have roughly about 30% of the firms which potentially could be fully automated. The machine learning models tend to do better for the less heavy-tailed in-sample residuals, with an edge of sparse group lasso due to when you do actually have heavier tails. Now, in terms of variable selection, here is a chart of that. And you get AR1 and AR4 most of the time as predictors. That's not too surprising. You have one of the sentiment indices that comes into play as well most of the time. These are the different quarters. Firm volatility actually enters into the set of regressors typically as well. Default risk, it comes in usually as well. And then there is a news item. This is not the analyst forecast. This is a news item in the Wall Street Journal about revenue growth that also appears as one of the regressors typically in our models. So to conclude, I don't know whether I didn't keep track of time, Andrew. I hope I'm doing okay.
Yes, you're right on time.
So this is sort of work on structural sparsity approach to high dimensional time series. Sampled, the same frequency case is a special case. The Legendre polynomials allowed us actually to formulate Midas regression models as a linear regression problem. So that puts us square into the convex optimization problems that we typically encounter in machine learning literature. The sparse group lasso allowed us to sort of balance the choice between, on the one hand, the covariates, and on the other hand, the lags of the covariance. It is simple, scalable, and robust projection methods, essentially. The theory sort of allows for heavy tail dependent data, and you can sort of see its impact on convergence rates and other asymptotic properties. And so that's very relevant for financial econometric applications. What is also nice is that there is a package, an R package, and also MATLAB code and Julio code available. So that's all in the public domain. We still are working on, remember that I mentioned that my paper with Ryan Ball, we kind of really looked at how machine learning can improve upon analyst forecasts. We deliberately did not include analyst forecast in our set of regressors, but by doing so, we're going to actually address the question of forecast combination. What was kind of interesting was that analysts tend to actually focus a lot on their industry. I mean, that's what they do. I mean, they are really specialized to the industry. What we found in the paper with Ryan is that they tend not to actually fully incorporate macro data, which is sort of what would be interesting to look at. Now that starts to look at basically hypothesis testing issues, which I alluded to in terms of Hag-based estimating, de-biased asymptotic estimators, etc. We still are in the process of doing this for the panel regression setting. That's, thank you. That's it. I stop sharing probably.
Yes, thanks very much, Eric. That's great. So now there are a couple of questions from the audience, but I think in the interest of keeping things moving, we'll go to the discussant, Max Farrell, and then we'll come back to the questions afterwards. So Max, over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me switch to my slides here. Just a couple slides to guide the issues that I want to talk about. So first I should say that I think this is a great paper. You know, I unfortunately didn't read all of the related papers that Eric also mentioned, but it is nice to see some of these techniques being pushed into really truly dependent data. That's something that I do want to highlight a couple of times here. So what I want to do is just quickly sort of recap what's going on in this paper and capture some of the crucial contributions from my point of view. You know, those of you who don't know me, I'm more of a micro, cross-sectional econometrician, and I'm further away from finance than probably anyone else on the attendance list. So I'll focus my discussion on some of the contributions that I see in that department. So what's going on in this paper is essentially looking at a panel data model, and as as Eric mentioned, one of the key challenges is this mixed frequency data that comes in. And so one of the key ideas that they exploit here is that if you have mixed frequency data, you can just reshape that into a new covariate vector if that's where the mixed frequency is. So for them, in their application areas and the other applications that Eric mentioned, you view the outcome as happening from time 1 to time capital T at those intervals. And then it's the predictors that you observe either at that frequency or at higher frequencies. So sort of the base level of observation is at the outcome and the errors. And then you may observe some predictors at higher frequencies. And that doesn't actually matter in the strictest sense once we view this as a panel data linear model, because we can just take those higher frequency observations, reshape them into columns instead of rows, and call that part of the covariates that we're going to use. Those are just more predictors. And so then we have just a big linear panel data model. And in some sense, that's standard from a high level. I'm obviously oversimplifying deliberately here, not dismissively, but just to give the key crucial idea here. And so what do we think is really non-standard? And from my view, there's two things which I think are nice here. One is that the dimensionality can be large, can be diverging with the sample size asymptotically. As Eric cited, there's a number of papers that are sort of talking about high dimensional panel models, but all of those are not just ignoring things like heavy tails, which are treated here, but are quite close to independence. So, from a cross-sectional econometrician point of view, one thing that I think we often say is that anything that you can prove with IID data will also hold for dependent data with some mixing conditions that are pretty weak. And partially we're being a little overly dismissive when we say that, but that is kind of true. But this paper actually pushes beyond that boundary. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, is that actually here the dependence is much, much heavier than that. The tails are heavier and the dependence is stronger. And so we're not in that sort of range where you can take something that we know holds in IID data and basically think that it holds here as well. And so the combination of high dimensionality and high dependence and heavy tails is something that hasn't existed in the literature, at least that I'm aware of. And so from a theoretical point of view, I think that's one of the crucial contributions here, and quite welcome, just because it does push the sort of machine learning to a new area that we haven't had as many formal results before. So hopefully I've got the notation matched to Eric's slides, although probably not, even though he did send them to me in advance. So what they do is they look at a sparse group lasso. The sparse group lasso, there's a large literature on this following this paper by Simon, Friedman, Hastie, and Tibshirani, which I only realized during Eric's talk. He cited as 2013 and I have as 2011. So we'll have to fact check each other on that one. And basically their idea in that original paper, and is exploited nicely here, is that you want to enforce some sort of group structure and also some sort of sparsity simultaneously. And what I like about this penalty, as opposed to other things like just a plain vanilla lasso, is that it's motivated from economics. And that's something that I want to touch on a few times here, is that at a number of points in his presentation and in the paper, the authors mention things that are grounded in economic reasoning, prior knowledge about the way the world operates in some manner or another, as opposed to just saying, well, we have a lot of data we need to regularize, let's throw something at it. And so we have something where the econometric method really is trying to reflect better the actual economics that we know and use. And that can be, I think, crucially important, both for gains in, prediction and other statistical quantities, but also in usefulness. The other small thing I want to highlight about the regression that they run, the penalized regression, is that the fixed effects are not penalized. So the paper has results for pooled estimators, but also fixed effects models. And in the fixed effects, they don't penalize the fixed effects. And that, I think, is the right way to go. I only want to highlight it because it seems like there's a large crowd of people for whom that is obvious and you would never consider penalizing the fixed effects, but it's not universal in the literature. In some of those papers that I'm alluded to or Eric mentioned on high dimensional panel data, they do regularize the fixed effects in some way. So I view this as the better option, and I think that's just something I wanted to highlight. And then, as with anything else, we need to somehow choose the penalty parameters, which are lambda, the overall regularization, and then gamma, which balances between the lasso and the group lasso components. The paper has theoretical results on how lambda should behave, rate conditions for its asymptotic validity, and also considers a couple of ways to do it in data. It's not clear if these are the optimal choices in any given sense in a theoretical way, but at least gives you something that's quite practical and actually works well in practice. And then the main results from this model, at least the ones I'll focus on, are just the consistency or convergence in prediction. So the predictions that come out of this model, the pooled model or the fixed effects models, right, are consistent at some rate. On my slides here, it's R1. And I actually want to highlight that this isn't a convergence rate in the typical sense. What they actually have is a stronger contribution, which is a high probability bound. So they characterize the probability with which some inequality holds, which is different than just saying that the left-hand side is big OP something. All right, so it's slightly stronger than that. And one thing that I want to highlight again, which Eric also did, is that the rates at which these things hold depend not only on the usual quantities that you see in IID results that are so common, the sparsity, the dimension P, which is the dimension of the regressors, and the sample sizes N and T, the cross-sectional and time dimension sample sizes. But the rates also depend on the moments that you have, how many finite moments there are, and on the dependent structure in some broad sense. And that's quite different from the IID case. And I think the paper gives a nice characterization of that. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of it that actually I would like to see explained and emphasized more in this paper, but also in the literature more broadly, is what do these restrictions really mean for a given data set? How do we interpret them? How can I be sure that I'm falling in one regime rather than another? Right, so if you look at the expression, the rate, which I've labeled here on my slides, R2, right, that quantity should go to 0, and it will at some rate, but that rate could be quite slow depending on all these other things, right? So if the dependence is high, if the dimension is high, all of these things sort of work against you. Then even though you may have a sharp bound, you have a very slow rate at which that bound holds in probability. And that can be something that we need to pay attention to better. All right, but the first step is clearly characterizing these things carefully, which the paper has done a really nice job of. I want to highlight what I thought were some of the interesting takeaways from the empirical results. At a high level, what the paper shows is that certainly more data is better, right? So the individual level models and the random walks and analyst forecasts are beaten quite handily by the panel data models. So there is some gain from all this extra information. And one of the big questions is, what is that gain? And how do we interpret it? Is it meaningful? So in the main table, which is table 1 in the paper that Eric showed, and also table A1 in the appendix, there's a lot of models which are roughly the same. So the pooled regression with cross-validation is the best, but by around 0.5% in root mean squared error. So quite a small gain. And so it's not clear to me, again, this is my subject area, if those gains are economically meaningful or not. My hunch is that they're not. The other thing that I will say is that these gains may be washed out if you just consider the randomness that's inherent in these results. And this is something that I wanted to highlight at a broader level, which I think is something that future research needs to tackle in these areas. So this isn't so much about this paper, but it is something that's sort of an issue that I see in this entire sort of machine learning plus economics literature, is that there's an inherent amount of randomness in these results that isn't there for typical applications, for classical methods. Right, so the regression here uses cross-validation, for example, to choose the tuning parameter lambda. Now, there's no such thing as non-parametrics without a tuning parameter. All non-parametrics have tuning parameters, and they always have. The difference here is that the tuning parameter choice is itself random, not just because the data is random in a frequentist sense, but also because we use it in a random way. Right? If you and I both run a kernel regression, we use the same code to say estimate the mean squared error, optimal bandwidth, or the inference optimal bandwidth. If we have the same code and the same data, we'll get the exact same answers. Now that's not true anymore, because if we both run cross-validation, if I pick 4-fold cross-validation and you pick 5-fold cross-validation, we'll get different answers. Even if we both pick 5-fold cross-validation, if my subsamples are different from your subsamples, we'll get different answers. Right? And in other machine learning methods, this problem is even worse, right? In other things that use stochastic optimization methods, you're going to also have this additional randomness. Now, if all you care about is, say, driving a car around or parallel parking automatically, this may not matter. All right, but once we're trying to do sort of something that's more science, this additional randomness may matter. It means that the results are not replicable in the way that they should be. And that's something that I think it is going to require future work in these machine learning plus economics areas. So this paper has that problem, but so does every single other paper in this area right now, including my own work and everything. So I think it just points us to a future direction. The other thing I want to highlight about the empirical findings, which I thought was very interesting, is that in the negative interpretation, all the models kind of did the same, so why are we bothering? And in the positive interpretation of that same thing, there's a lot of robustness here that I thought was interesting. The authors were kind enough to share their data and their code with me, so I was able to run some things myself and explore this a little bit more. One thing that's that I noted is that it really is pretty insensitive to some of these tuning parameter choices, which is not that common. In typical non-parametrics, the results can be quite sensitive to tuning parameter choice. And here that's less true. For example, this gamma parameter that trades off between the sparseness in the group lasso and the sparseness in the overall lasso doesn't really matter. Right? You can set that to anything between 0 and 1, and you get basically the same results. It's also true that you better do some regularization. So we have this idea that more data is better for prediction, but if you just throw everything in an unrestrained way, it doesn't work at all. So I tried just plain least squares. That fails miserably. One thing that's getting a lot of attention in the machine learning community is some sort of minimum norm regression. That also is worse by about an order of magnitude than the sparse group lasso results. On the other hand, random forests do essentially just as well, although we have no theory whatsoever for that. So I just ran that right out of the box, and it does pretty well in terms of mean squared error. But of course, that comes with no theoretical guarantees. The final thing I want to mention about the empirical results before I zoom out more broadly is that the fixed effects and random effects estimators did very similarly. Fixed random effects being the pooled estimators. So the fixed effect estimators, they pay a huge price for estimating consistently these fixed effects, and you need a longer panel and other regularity conditions. And so the pooled estimator might be a better choice in a short panel. And so maybe these results are quite encouraging for using pooled estimation in shorter panels when you don't have a very long panel to work with. And so again, I view that as a type of robustness. These predictions are robust to some sort of heterogeneity. And I think that's an interesting finding. The last thing I want to do is just sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about, prediction and interpretability of these models. So this is sort of a callback to what Eric mentioned about the self-driving cars, although I didn't think of it in that way. But it's the same idea, right? This paper is really trying to walk a very narrow tightrope of thinking about using machine learning and big data to obtain better predictions, but also still having interpretability and meaning. And we know that's a very hard line to walk, and sometimes it's theoretically even impossible, right? So interpreting the variables selected by lasso is only theoretically valid under much stronger conditions than we like to put. But in practice, obviously, that's a crucial thing to do. And you can see that in the way that it's presented in the paper and the way Eric discussed it, right? In terms of using these polynomials to capture the shape of the time dependence, in terms of looking at which variables are selected. That's crucial for interpretation, for communication, for comparing to previous results, for making sure we understand what we're doing. So the question is, well, what do we want out of our models, right? In some sense, we want both, but we can't have it. And so I think this paper does a nice job of trying to walk that line. But I think, again, this sort of calls for much more work, right? What kind of interpretation is important here? And how can we make sure that we get valid theory while also having some sort of meaningful interpretation? Right now, in the whole of sort of economics plus machine learning, we don't have a great answer for that. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Maybe we can borrow from some of these interpretable machine learning works that are happening right now in the ML and CS communities. But clearly we need something different for economics than they're interested in those cases. And the question is, what exactly is it that we want, and how should we go about getting it so that we make sure that it's both useful for prediction, but also meaningful and theoretically valid? And so I think this paper is sort of trying to walk that line very carefully. And I think there's just a lot more work to be done to make sure that that is something that we really can and want to do. So let me stop there and give it back to Andrew for question and answer and other things.
Okay, thanks very much, Max. That's great. Well, we're a little bit over time, but maybe Eric, if you'd like to give a brief response, and then we'll move Q&A to the post-seminar hangout session.
Quick responses. These are great comments. And many of them actually are kind of more broad discussions about machine learning applications, most of which I apply. I mean, I agree with, I think, what I tell my MBA students is domain knowledge is still a very important component of implementation of machine learning algorithms. And that's sort of what you've been alluding to. Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are things that we do sort of can look at, such as persistence. I mean, so these convergence rates, the tails versus the persistence. We know kind of the persistence, say, for price earnings ratios. We looked at them empirically, so we have a sense on how important that is. We all know that near unit truth behavior is much more problematic. That is not the case for price earnings ratios. Interpretability is a big issue, even for regulators. When you get to a lot of the deep learning models, they just are very opaque and not transparent, and we don't have any clue about their asymptotic properties. Dynamic deep learning models is just an unknown thing, actually, in terms of properties. I agree with you, and Ryan is here on the panel, but Ryan has sort of done applications of Midas in accounting, and the Midas polynomial shapes do sort of have sometimes an economic interpretation on the timing of release of information, etc. So there is some mapping into intuition or economic intuition. Of course, we are still talking about reduced form models. And so it is more an interpretation of these weights that sometimes matches with some intuition. But these are great comments, and it's more of a conversation that is about machine learning in general, which I would love to continue, but it's perhaps we should go to the questions perhaps at this point. Thank you, Max.
All right, thanks very much, both Max and Eric. It was a great seminar, great discussion today. We've got a few questions sort of queued up, so there's stick around for the Q&A session. But before we leave, let me do a brief advertisement for the next SoFiE Seminar. Next SoFiE Seminar will be in 2 weeks' time. The speaker will be Roger Quaidvleeg from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and his discussant will be Peter Hansen from across campus at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of Eric's colleagues. So please join us then. That's on April 5, 2 weeks' time.